There are men in history who are difficult to write about, not because the evidence is unclear, or the story is complicated, or the judgment is hard to make, but because what they did is so far outside the boundaries of what human beings are supposed to be capable of doing to each other that putting it into words feels almost impossible. Oskar Dirlewanger is one of those men. He was not a desk murderer. He was not a bureaucrat who signed paperwork from a comfortable office while other people did the actual killing. He was the man in the field, the man with the weapon, the man who did things so extreme that his fellow SS commanders, men who were themselves running concentration camps and executing civilians by the thousands, wrote formal complaints about him to their superiors and demanded that he be stopped. Read that again. SS generals. Men who built and ran the Holocaust. Men who had personally overseen mass murder on an industrial scale. Those men looked at what Oskar Dirlewanger was doing and decided that someone needed to draw a line. That is who we are talking about today. That is the level we are operating at. And the most disturbing part of his entire story is not what he did in the war. It is the fact that by the time the war gave him the opportunity to do those things, he had already spent 20 years showing everyone around him exactly who he was. Nobody should have been surprised. Nobody should have given him a unit to command. And yet they did. This is the story of Oskar Dirlewanger, and it does not have a single redeeming moment in it from beginning to end. Oskar Dirlewanger was born on September 26, 1895, in Würzburg, Bavaria, into a middle-class family that gave him every opportunity a young German man of his generation could reasonably expect. He was intelligent, genuinely, measurably intelligent, the kind of person who could have done almost anything with his life if he had pointed that intelligence in any direction other than the one he chose. He served in the First World War and by all accounts was a capable and brave soldier, decorated multiple times, wounded multiple times, rising to command a machine gun company by the end of the conflict. The war did something to a lot of young German men of his generation. It did something particularly extreme to Oskar Dirlewanger. He came out of it having apparently concluded that violence was not just a tool or a necessity, but something closer to a purpose. After the war, he joined the Free Corps, the irregular paramilitary units that fought in the chaotic violence of post-war Germany and the eastern borderlands, and continued doing the only thing he seemed to genuinely enjoy. He eventually returned to civilian life and somehow, remarkably, managed to complete a doctorate in political science in 1922. Dr. Oskar Dirlewanger. That title sits alongside everything else in his biography, like a piece of furniture in the wrong room, completely incongruous, impossible to reconcile with what comes before and after it. He joined the Nazi Party early, in 1923, which put him among the true believers who had been there from the beginning. And then, in 1934, he did something that ended his legitimate career permanently and should have ended his involvement in any position of authority or responsibility for the rest of his life. He was convicted of sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was expelled from the Nazi Party. He lost his position, and in any functional society, in any organization with any standards at all, that would have been the end of Oskar Dirlewanger's story. It was not the end. Because the Third Reich was not a functional society with standards, and because Dirlewanger had a friend in a very important place, That friend was Gottlob Berger, one of Himmler's senior SS officers, who had known Dirlewanger since their time together in the Freikorps, and who apparently believed that whatever Dirlewanger's personal failings might be, his skills as a violent and aggressive military commander were too valuable to waste. Berger lobbied on Dirlewanger's behalf. He worked the system, and in 1940, in one of the most consequential and catastrophic personnel decisions of the entire war, he got Dirlewanger reinstated, got him back into the SS, and got him command of a unit. Not just any unit. A unit built specifically around the concept of using convicted criminals as soldiers. Poachers, initially. Men convicted of wildlife crimes who were considered to have the tracking and fieldcraft skills useful for anti-partisan operations. The unit was called the SS Special Unit Dirlewanger, and it was, from its very first day of existence, an organization designed and commanded by a man who had already demonstrated clearly and specifically what he was. The unit was deployed to occupied Poland in 1940, and what happened there established the pattern that would repeat itself everywhere. Dirlewanger and his men went for the next 5 years. They were tasked with anti-partisan operations, hunting down resistance fighters in the forests and villages of occupied territory. Anti-partisan operations in the Second World War were already deeply criminal across most of the forces conducting them, involving collective punishment, the execution of civilian hostages, the burning of villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters. Dirlewanger took all of that and went somewhere else entirely. His unit did not distinguish between partisans and civilians. His unit did not take prisoners in any meaningful sense. His unit treated the villages it operated in as environments to be destroyed, and the people in them as targets rather than bystanders. Complaints began arriving at SS headquarters almost immediately. Local SS and police commanders in Poland wrote to their superiors describing what Dirlewanger's unit was doing and asking for it to be controlled or removed. These were not complaints from squeamish civilians. These were SS officers who were themselves conducting brutal occupation policies, who were themselves participating in the systematic murder of Jews and other civilians across occupied Poland, and they were writing formal complaints about Dirlewanger. Himmler received the complaints, he reviewed them, and he kept Dirlewanger in command. This tells you something important about how the SS actually functioned. Not as a monolithic organization with consistent standards, even within its own criminal framework, but as a system where personal connections and perceived usefulness could override almost any other consideration. Berger continued to protect Dirlewanger. Himmler continued to find uses for him. The complaints continued to arrive and continued to be filed away without consequence. The unit expanded over time, its recruitment pool broadening from poachers to include other categories of convicted criminals. Men serving sentences for violent crimes, for sexual offenses, for a range of offenses that in any other context would have made them permanent outcasts from any military organization. Dirlewanger actively sought out the most violent and unstable men he could find, apparently on the theory that the qualities that made a man dangerous and uncontrollable in civilian society were exactly the qualities he needed in his unit. He was building something deliberate. He was not accidentally accumulating a collection of dangerous men. He was constructing a unit whose function was to be beyond the limits that constrained other formations, to go to the places and do the things that even the SS hesitated to order through normal channels. The Eastern Front expanded his theater of operations and expanded the scale of what his unit did. In Belarus, in Ukraine, in the vast occupied territories where German anti-partisan operations were conducted with a brutality that remains difficult to fully comprehend. Even with decades of historical scholarship behind us, Dirlewanger's unit operated at a level that drew repeated formal protests from Wehrmacht commanders, from other SS commanders, from civil administrators who were watching entire regions being depopulated in ways that served no military purpose and actively undermined the German occupation's ability to extract economic resources from the territory. General Kurt von Gottberg, himself deeply implicated in the mass murder of civilians in Belarus, filed formal complaints about Dirlewanger's methods. Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger, the higher SS and police leader in occupied Poland, tried repeatedly to have Dirlewanger removed or court-martialed. These were not good men trying to stop evil. These were men who were themselves participating in mass murder, trying to impose some kind of operational limit on someone who had gone beyond any limit they recognized. The complaints did not work. Dirlewanger had Berger. Berger had Himmler's ear. And Himmler, whatever his private reservations may have been, kept finding new assignments for the unit and kept promoting its commander. In 1943, Dirlewanger was promoted to SS-Oberführer, a senior rank that reflected not a judgment that he was behaving acceptably, but a judgment that he was useful. The unit's strength grew. Its composition continued to include convicted criminals, but it also began absorbing Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to fight for Germany in exchange for their lives, members of various foreign volunteer formations, and an increasingly diverse collection of men whose common characteristic was that they had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. Dirlewanger commanded this collection with a combination of fear, violence, and the particular charisma that extremely dangerous men sometimes possess. The ability to make other dangerous men follow them not out of loyalty or respect, but out of a recognition that this person is more frightening than anything else in the environment. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 is where the story reaches its most documented and most horrifying point. In August 1944, the Polish Home Army rose against the German occupation of Warsaw in one of the most courageous and ultimately tragic acts of resistance of the entire war. The Germans responded by sending in forces to crush the uprising, and among those forces was Dirlewanger's unit. What his men did in Warsaw in August and September 1944 is recorded in extraordinary detail because Warsaw was not a remote forest village. It was a major European capital with witnesses, with survivors, with records that were preserved, and testimonies that were collected after the war. His unit moved through the Wola district of Warsaw in the first days of the uprising, and participated in massacres that killed between 30,000 and 60,000 civilians in a matter of days. Hospitals were entered and patients were killed. Women and children were used as human shields. Buildings were set on fire with people locked inside them. The scale and the deliberateness of what happened in Wola represents one of the largest single massacres of civilians in the entire European theater of the Second World War, and Dirlewanger's unit was at the center of it. Even in the context of the Warsaw Uprising, which was characterized by extreme brutality on the German side across multiple units, Dirlewanger's conduct drew formal protests. SS-Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Selewski, who commanded all German forces suppressing the uprising, and was himself a man with a long record of involvement in mass atrocities, filed complaints about Dirlewanger's unit and attempted to have it pulled back from operations in the city. Boczylewski, a man who had overseen the killing of tens of thousands of civilians in anti-partisan operations, looked at what Dirlewanger was doing in Warsaw and decided it needed to stop. That protest, like all the others before it, produced limited results. The unit continued operating. The killing continued. By late 1944, the military situation had deteriorated to the point where Germany was desperate for any combat power it could assemble, and Dirlewanger's unit was reorganized and expanded into a full division, the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, and deployed to the front lines against Soviet forces. This transition from anti-partisan operations to conventional warfare against a modern military force did not go well, which should surprise nobody. A formation built around the principle of maximum violence against defenseless civilians does not necessarily translate into an effective fighting force against an opponent that can shoot back with tanks and artillery. The unit suffered heavy casualties, and its performance in conventional combat was, by German military standards, poor. Dirlewanger was wounded multiple times in this period and spent significant time in hospitals. The end came in May 1945, in the chaos of Germany's final collapse. Dirlewanger was captured by French forces, specifically by Moroccan soldiers serving in the French army, near the town of Altshausen in southwestern Germany. He was held in a prison facility while authorities decided what to do with him. He never faced trial. On June 7, 1945, less than a month after Germany's surrender, Oskar Dirlewanger died in custody. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. The accounts of survivors and witnesses suggest that the Moroccan guards, who were aware of who they were holding and what he had done, administered a rather more direct form of justice over the course of several days. The precise circumstances of his death have never been fully established. What is established is that he died in a prison cell in June 1945, without trial, without a formal accounting, without the public reckoning that his victims deserved to see. There is a particular historical argument that gets made about men like Oskar Dirlewanger. The argument that the system made him, that the conditions of total war and Nazi ideology created the environment that allowed him to function, that he was a product of circumstances rather than simply a monster who found the right circumstances. That argument deserves to be rejected clearly and specifically in his case, because the timeline does not support it. Oskar Dirlewanger was convicted of sexually assaulting a child in 1934, 9 years before Warsaw, before the Eastern Front, before any of the operations that historians sometimes use to explain the behavior of men who might otherwise have lived ordinary lives. He was who he was before the war gave him the opportunity to be that person at scale. The war did not create Oskar Dirlewanger. The war gave Oskar Dirlewanger an army. And the men who gave him that army, Berger, Himmler, the system that found him useful and kept promoting him despite the complaints and the protests and the formal records of what he was doing, those men share the responsibility for every single thing that followed. The most frightening thing about his story is not the man himself. It is the institution that looked at everything he was and decided he was an asset worth protecting. Because institutions that make that calculation do not do it once. They do it over and over again, every time the person in question seems useful enough to justify the cost. And the cost, in Dirlewanger's case, was paid entirely by the people who had the misfortune of finding themselves in the path of his unit. They paid it in Warsaw. They paid it in Belarus. They paid it in Poland. And they paid it because a system built on the logic of violence decided that a man who had already shown everyone exactly who he was should be given a gun and a command and sent out into the world to be exactly that person, at the largest scale that the circumstances allowed.